Good evening, everyone. It's it is now 6 o'clock. We're close to St. Patrick's Church, and you can probably hear the bells. We'll wait for the bells to stop ringing, and then and we'll begin. Perfect. I think we're good to go. So, thank you everyone for joining us. This is the fifth installation of the Hamilton Center for Civic Inclusion Anti-Racism Conference that was supposed to happen March the 28th and 29th, but due to COVID, we had to transpose everything online. So this is the fifth installment that we're doing, and it is our estimation that we'll continue these online sessions possibly until July. Um, for those of you that have been tuning in, you will notice that we haven't done a land acknowledgement. Um, I think uh, land acknowledgements are very important. And for us at HCCI, we're always talking about meaningful ways to be in solidarity with indigenous sovereignty. And so every time we've had one of these sessions, we have always shared some resources from the Yellowhead Institute. And if you haven't heard of them before, the Yellowhead Institute is an institute that provides reports and special features that consider key questions of indigenous governance and offer substantive critiques and alternatives to settler colonialism in Canada. So I encourage all of you to visit their website, yellowheadinstitute.org. They released a report in June titled COVID-19 Numbered Treaties and the Politics of Life. I encourage all of you to read the report and other reports that are available online. So this is our way of providing tangible actions to support indigenous sovereignty and to also understand the impacts of settler colonialism. Before I hand it over to Dr. Ameil Joseph, I would also like to thank all the sponsors that made this event happen. So most of the funding for this conference was received from the Canadian Heritage Department. So we thank them very much. Would also like to thank the Ontario Council of Age Agencies Serving Immigrants, OCASI, and Rabble Media, the YWCA, the Sexual Assault Center for Hamilton and Area, the Hamilton Immigration Partnership Council, and the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for supporting us, providing us with resources, some financial, some other resources that we're able to help with putting this online conference on and to happen. So today we have the one and only Dr. Ameil Joseph, a professor from the School of Social Work at McMaster, and today he'll be talking about defying racism in Hamilton. So we'll pass it over to Dr. Ameil Joseph, and after Dr. Ameil Joseph is done with his speech, um, and then we'll open it up to questions. As you, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, so you can funnel in your questions, and once we receive them, we'll we'll let everyone know of the questions, and hopefully Dr. Joseph can answer them to the best of his ability. So, Dr. Joseph, we hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being with me now. For those of you who recognize the struggle, the impossibility of talking about racism in Hamilton in an hour, I feel you. I know the anxiety to try and speak to it all at once, to say it all in the windows we're allowed to speak through. I'm grateful to the organizers of this conference to permit more than that, and to the interpreters. I know that racism is everywhere all the time and too much to bear, yet at the same time resisted and undermined, exposed with defiance by a great number of our community members every day, sometimes all day, sometimes all day and night. It is exhausting. I am exhausted. But it's not a new exhaustion. It is the exhaustion that I saw on my grandparents' faces growing up, on my parents, on the faces of my aunties and uncles. They taught us to love deeply and protectively. It's the kind of exhaustion that we fight to eradicate so that the next generation doesn't have to bear it again. But it feels like a trap. When I teach about racism, people often circle around within the individual understandings of bigotry and hatred. That discrimination based on race can exist in a service or program or a system. Yet racism is a system, as a system, becomes this place of denial and refusal. They agree that we should address the bigots when discrimination is obviously based on race, but that is where everyone seems to stop. That's where they pause. And that's where they agree to go that far in their interventions. They agree that trainings will help them learn about bigotry and hatred and discrimination, that they can have a discrimination policy to handle blatant cases of complaint, and that this is some sort of systemic intervention. Well, that far is as far as they decided to go. That far is neither a systemic nor structural transformation. That far is not what Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been asking for generations. That far is what is exhausting. That far fails to acknowledge and validate the concept of privilege as individually based, and how that it detracts from our attentions to a historically established system that tells you that what your decision to go only as far as you did, that decision is reasonable, that it's rational, that it's enough, because you've been trained to believe that that decision is rational, neutral, objective, and your position of privilege has been earned and deserved, achieved. That spot, this far, this is what my father would say, a dad, a dal and rice of racism. The staple where the systems around us in policy, in practice, in law, in our day-to-day interactions tell you that you know better than me, and that you are where you are and I am where I am because of merit. That, folks, is a system, and that system is white supremacy. That is not calling you a Nazi or the KKK. That too is individually focused. But critiquing white supremacy as a system has to be understood as asking all of us how we think about social order and human hierarchy. It is asking us how we think about nation and state, about national identity and the histories that are told about us that leave some histories untold or erased. We have to get past this. We have to defy this, but it is exhausting to do this when we come back to these moments of empathy or understanding, and the willingness to change ends with your comfort at the expense of ours. It is exhausting listening to media seek out and interview and publish the opinions of racialized folks who have been shaped by the world around us, who believe the dominant discourses of ignoring racial disparities and inequities, and just trying to survive through it by working hard. The odd case is not the pattern. It is not the system. See, racism is not the exception. It is not episodic or intermittent. It has been the rule. Racism is the axiom. The defiance of these rules is the history we could tell. We can defy the rules that claim a position of neutrality and impartiality and objectivity when we know that discrimination and ideas of the deserving, the inferior, and the superior are folded into every aspect of our lives. We can refuse to obey, to be obedient to this rule that pretends there is a fair side to life. On Monday night, we saw legends take up our streets, the culmination of 4 years of work, the same squad that was threatened with the loss of the Black Youth Mentorship Program for talking about unaddressed racism in their school and the need to remove police from their schools. They were able to have their asks determine how far we go and how far is enough to remove police from schools. They defied intimidation tactics, the backroom emails, the phone calls that attempted to threaten and silence them. How do we get to a place where understandings are not confined to sympathy after you witness an atrocity, or confined to individual understandings of race and racism? How can we speak of the histories of colonialism in Canada, how the notions of who was deemed desirable based on an idea of hereditary threat or defectiveness was openly advocated for by our government and enshrined in policy inside of professions and disciplines and law? These ideas harnessed the rise of scientific racism and eugenics, rationalized their implementation for the projects of heteronationalism, attaching ideas of criminality to mental health and disability as biological threat. They attached poverty to an idea of biological or hereditary condition, like poor people were inherently different. These processes don't arise in isolation. When we talk about racialization, this is the process, the confluence of ideas that were forged into Canada's Immigration Act. They're evident in our Mental Health Act. They were consolidated in the Indian Act and exercised in our criminal code. We can speak this only in its complexity. How can you say this in a one-page statement or in a single delegation to council? How can we state this in a 10-minute news segment or a 1,000-word op-ed? We have to defy the attempts to silence the complexities of our experiences. Do we have to educate people in an hour or an afternoon about Chinese head taxes, Japanese internment, turned away ships of South Asian and Jewish people, and chattel slavery, of the stories of Black settlements that are erased, or how South African politicians came to Canada in the 1940s to learn from our racism in the Indian Act, how to use status cards and the reserve system in apartheid. We have seen a level of racism that would defy reason. Was in the first grade, the first time my peers would use racial slurs to insult me. Six years old. There was no one to help. We would learn in the classroom that somehow Europe was the source of all knowledge and history. You didn't get any recognition of the thousands of years of knowledge and civilization from anywhere else. The curriculum itself was insulting to me. Where would I complain? When someone wrote the N-word on our license plate in the driveway of our home, or yelled at my father to go back to his country, going through a fast food drive-through, I was still growing up. I was a boy. The hurt was ours, and no one really did anything. When I think about experience, I've been trained to explain away my direct experiences as an Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Guyanese Canadian, being questioned in healthcare settings about drug use, about my parents' ability to parent, being pulled over for driving in a neighborhood that I have been identified as not belonging to, being asked to undress at airports, being followed, while shopping. Anti-immigration rhetoric was regularly in the newspaper and in the paper. The system constantly told us that we did not exist, belong, or were a threat. So don't be angry when we tell you that language is hurtful. We didn't do anything wrong. Your feeling of entitlement to the right to live a life that depends on a racist society is also a product of white supremacy. There are histories of knowledge that have been omitted from our view, that don't allow us to speak or for our stories to be told. And we can and do defy these acts of omission. We defy the corny racism of anti-racism statements when we live the reality of erasure and dismissal every day. It's exhausting because honestly, you have to ask yourself, how could this much ignorance have so much power over us? How could it be so blatant and yet have so much influence, extract so much of our labor and time? It's not just that I'm tired, over-asked, or over-assigned. It's that the asks are without listening, without supports. They're exploitative and appropriating, then dismissive and excruciating. In a system designed to take from me and give to you and tell you that me complaining is the problem. Racism is something that you can talk to everyone about, yet we cannot tell anyone about it. That results in its end. You have to defy this with us. We're often made to feel like asking is inappropriate, that speaking is out of place and naming is insolent, that asking for less than the minimum is the only way to get to a yes, that those yeses are small victories even when we use them to divide our focus and attention, to divide the confluence of ways that the oppression of racialized groups of Black and Indigenous and people of color is bound together and evident all around us, but not equivalent or the same. We have to also defy the oversimplification of how we understand and talk about racism. When we talk about racism in Hamilton, if you don't live here, if you don't live in Hamilton, you don't know. Where do we start? In Hamilton, many begin as though racism somehow fell from the sky. And there's a common refrain. That story tells itself as when a Hindu Samaj in Hamilton in September of 2001 was set ablaze in a hate crime, actually targeting Muslim community members, but even getting that wrong. There were gatherings and initiatives, statements that stated an attack against one is an attack on us all. But you can draw a line from where people decided that individual levels of redress were as far as they wanted to go to the September 2016, the Ibrahim Jami Mosque on King was attacked, arson as well, and another hate crime. We could take all of the 15 years in between, name people, lives, incidents, we also need to talk about systems and our complicities. Rarely do we speak of the slave trader Samuel Hatt, the indigenous lands we occupy, the KKK's influence in this area, or that black settlements were here before Hamilton was Hamilton, and juxtapose this with the fact that the first black city councilor was not elected until 2014. We can do a better job of telling and learning from those who have been acting in defiance of racism all along. We are also all too often reminded of the acute conditions of racism in Hamilton every time we hear and hear again that Hamilton has the highest amount of police reported hate crimes per capita of all cities in Canada. We're reminded when hate groups organized and demonstrated every weekend outside of Hamilton City Hall for months to promote their racist anti-immigration sentiments and anti-LGBTQ bigotry. We were reminded when we learned that the former leader of one of the most notorious white nationalist groups in Canada was working in City Hall, and his employment was covered up. We are reminded when a political party leader speaks at Mohawk College on white nationalist propaganda, and Hamilton police decide to stand side by side with white nationalist groups to oppose protesters. We are reminded every time news of a racist attack occurs. Anti-Black, anti-Muslim, anti-Indigenous, anti-Semitic racism remains alive and well here. Time and time again, we urge leaders to respond, and they decide how far is enough, and we defy them still. I name these contexts alongside the vandalism to the rainbow crosswalks in front of City Hall and at McMaster, the posting of white supremacist recruitment posters at McMaster University. These carry ideas that mobilize racist, cis hetero-nationalist, anti-immigrant discourses that emerge alongside false notions that Canada is somehow under threat by immigrants, and that a white Canadian identity is somehow under threat. What is exhausting is how we are made to oscillate between the intermittent recognitions as if someone is making us decide between them, between the racist massacre, like for example the Quebec mosque shooting, and then we're deciding to attend to massacre and anti-Muslim violence and the wet sweat protests and the murder of George Floyd, the video of RCMP beating Chief Alan Adam, and the day-to-day racism of a colleague making a microaggressive statement to your coworkers by email. And then the police board in Hamilton discussing how they don't understand nor care about how to collect data on racism. Then having to explain why hiring a former police chief who sent a racist email to his officers and defended carding is a bad idea. We have racist arson, hate crimes, community members asking for something, anything, and being told time and time again that they will be, conducting trainings and reviewing the discrimination policy instead of changing the composition and resourcing of power. I remember reading Robin Maynard's book, the section on Shavana Abdi, the horrific story of how law enforcement dragged this 26-year-old trans woman down more than half a dozen flights of stairs and killed them in 2003 in police custody, and how that was somehow ruled an accident. It reminded me of my own work on internal inquiries that have and continue to rationalize racialized violence systemically within mental health and criminal justice systems, making excuses for killing people with disabilities and mental health issues who most often are Black or Indigenous and people of color. What surprises me about that story is that I had heard every other version except that one. I had heard the words accidents and not charged, and SIU investigation concluded, but never did I hear black trans woman dragged down 7 flights of stairs, killed by police. I think about when Robin Maynard and Sandy Hudson came to McMaster University to speak to a few people, community leaders, and the Black Youth Mentorship Program. I was asked to say a few words at the end of thanks, but was inspired myself by the event. Every student got a copy of that book, Policing Black Lives. They were gifted an analysis, an example of defiance to take with them in their lives, to write in their papers, to speak truth to white supremacy. I ended up sharing a copy of my own book with Robin about racism and in the forensic mental health system and deportation, and thinking about how mental health and criminal justice and immigration systems, knowledges, and professions have and continue to work together for ongoing eugenic, racial, and colonial projects. I thought about how I would have never and never did have any such moment where I could be in a room. I'm thinking about my experiences growing up, where I could be in a room and learn from people like Robin and Sandy Hudson. I think we can do more to move beyond the place where we talk about racism in our everyday. You tell us you have trainings in discrimination policy and EDI strategies, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And when there is an atrocity, some put out a statement. They promise more, yet dictate the terms of transformation and change. Those determinations are often decided not with and not from those who experience this suffering. And this can't continue. We must defy the rules of racism that orchestrate the patterns of white supremacy within our lives, that exhaust us in a cyclical arrangement of silence and erasure and omission that results in harm and death. We can act in defiance with those local leaders who have been showing us that we can defy what has even been deemed possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joseph. I don't know where to start. I think you highlighted a number of examples. You talked about the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board Kids Need Help group that showed Hamilton how to defy these rules of racism. Looking ahead, and I have to ask you a question. And for those of you that are tuning in, this is the time to send in your questions via Facebook or YouTube or Twitter, so that we can ask Dr. Ameil your questions. So please feel free to ask your questions through the comment sections. So while you're thinking about your questions, I will ask Dr. Ameil the first question. So in your experience of dealing with these issues, whether at McMaster or in your other work, can you share with our listeners how insidious racism is when dealing with those that have institutional power, whether at McMaster, whether at the city, and any other institutions that you've dealt with? Because I think sometimes people don't understand how racism operates when you are actually asking institutions to, for example, start an anti-racism center or terminate a contract of someone that has been deemed to be engaged in racial profiling. Like, can you expand on that a little bit so that people can see what happens in those rooms? and why we don't see the necessary change?
When you asked that question, I had like a rush of like dozens of people and faces and experiences. You know, I remember when we started the Race, Racism, and Racialization Working Group at PACBIC, you and I, and the word race wasn't spoken. And this is the President's Advisory Committee on Building Inclusive Community. It wasn't a thing that people talked about. It was almost not there, but there, everywhere, for us. You could see it. And maybe there was a reason why those things weren't talked about in those kinds of entities, because people knew better. Maybe they learned. They weren't as naive as I to think that we could advance a struggle in a way that gets us somewhere. It took years before we got to a place where we advocated for an AVP, equity and inclusion. And that came out of, community upset over the hiring of Glenda Care. It was a specific ask that looked to transform the ways people thought about community and racism at the senior levels of administration. The stuff that comes into mind, that rushes in, are the experiences of being gaslit, like talking to someone one-to-one who tells you that they believe, that they hear you, that they value these perspectives on how to challenge race and racism and attend to issues of colonialism and to think historically and to do more than tokenize a particular person and add a checkbox or that kind of thing. Someone that, thinks more strategically. And this is before, the hiring of a AVP, equity and inclusion. But I remember a part of that process, being yelled at in front of 70 people on this committee that I was chairing for speaking out, for writing a letter of protest, condemning transphobia. I remember being yelled at in a hiring committee with 10 other people, where because I brought up the idea that it might not be a good one to add a social fitness kind of assessment to a hiring process, where there's going to be like a house and a gathering and wine and cheese kind of thing. All of those moments, you feel singled out, and the actions don't line up with the commitments, and they build a sense of mistrust, and you feel like you start over again and you start over again. Every time we went to the city of Hamilton and brought a proposal for the Anti-Racism Resource Center, we always had to explain why. There was, decades of reports and studies and things, but it wasn't until, somebody else's money was on the table that legitimized our ask, where that it got to yes. I think some of the insidiousness digs at me in those ways. Those moments where you had a moment of trust and you were deceived, and then you're publicly condemned or publicly humiliated. I was the first person of color, a racialized person, to ever chair that committee. I think about, people who I connected with through that work that tell me those same stories in other areas, in their own work to try and change something in their department or in their classroom, and that stuff all weighs on you together as well.
Yeah. We have a question from long-standing Ken Stone on Facebook. He says, "Dear Joseph, would you please elaborate on your comment that we must change the composition and resourcing of power?"
Hmm. I think there have been asks about how we resource things differently, and then who gets to make decisions and how are they done, and how do these determine and frame or reframe asks for justice. What I was talking about in my talk was specifically that often people will, after an atrocity, recognize that racism is a thing, but usually in over-individualized ways. So they'll agree to address the bigots. They'll agree to follow through with a discrimination policy. But the asks were not that. The asks were for changing hiring processes, dismantling entire institutions that are deemed to be racist or founded on racist ideas, to pull apart disciplines, to allow for a space for people to study the critiques of knowledge itself. Changing not only the bodies, but the disciplines and the knowledges that are brought into some of these spaces that are allowed to critique. Very often you see diversity being bodies of the other, arranged in a different pattern or way, yet the system, the structure, the analysis maintains itself. It stays the same. Where we don't have an influx, a penetration of MAD studies, of critical disability studies, of Black studies, of gender studies, of anti-colonial studies, of Indigenous studies, you don't see these things also arise or become part of the change. And when we have those asks, you can't do those things for free. To change the analysis, to change the design, to change the structure of how decisions are made and who is spoken about and who is spoken to. This all has to be pulled apart differently. And that is a redistribution of resources. And they come from somewhere. And, some of the public arguments are we can take those from policing. We can take those from the universities that have been undermining some of the projects of equity. We can take those, we can take the symbols of our silence down. We can take resources and create things differently. But if the same people are making the decision around who creates what, we end up often reproducing the same patterns of tokenism and exclusion and neglect.
Yeah, we have another question from Nazia. Question is, Dr. Joseph. Oh, my question for Dr. Joseph is that how do we as racialized people determine who is an actual white ally when we've been betrayed and tokenized over and over again?
Can you ask it again?
The question is, how do we as racialized people determine who is an actual white ally when we've been betrayed and tokenized over and over again?
That is a good question that I think many have been trying to articulate an answer to. And this comes out in the asks and how we listen and how listening is responded to. When someone tells you what they want, and you tell them you don't think so, that doesn't feel like allyship. When or you express an analysis, share an experience, tell someone about a system, a structure, an encounter, an interaction that is racist or connected to systems of racism, and they tell you they get it, that they're with you, that they'll back you up, and then they don't. That betrayal is hard to cope with. But I think we need to also focus less on trying to understand how people deceive us, and focus more on having the power, the resources, the attentions to what Black, Indigenous, and people of color are asking for, and how those can transform these systems so that the opportunity for betrayal no longer can exist in the same way.
Thank you. Yeah, the questions keep coming. The questions keep coming. The next one is: can you please talk about the relationship between racism and gentrification in Hamilton?
Well, I think there's words that come from a particular kind of analysis that appreciates maybe things in aggregates. So when we talk about poverty, sometimes we're not so good at thinking about disaggregated ways of thinking about the racialization of poverty. We do so in healthcare. We sometimes are less well equipped broadly with analyses that allow people to speak about the nuances of oppression in systems and services, their historical roots, not only in the encounter and the service treatment and access and equity, so where people come in and out, but how they are crafted in the first place, the knowledges and disciplines that inform them and their practice. I think we can do better with some of that nuance, putting it to work to help us critique systems. So with the question of gentrification, I think you think about how values are used strategically to push some people out, and how that has been a historically designed way that power exercises itself to ensure a particular image is reproduced of a citizen subject of a population. But that is never divorced from a who we're talking about. There's always a project underneath, whether you acknowledge it or not. Ways that people think about property values and connect them to space and race and mental health and substance use, sex work, and these ideas that have been consolidated for decades, at least a couple generations. What I was referring to earlier as these notions of desirability and undesirability, of worth, of deserving, and the inferior, those who are described in terms of threat and burden and lack, who we want out of society. I think our analyses could do better to say more than what gentrification as a word does, as an analytical point, to say more in a more nuanced way than obscure more than it reveals.
Yeah, Hamilton and gentrification is always a huge discussion, even among artists and community and at city council and what have you. So yes, we can definitely do better. Um, uh, I'm scrolling through here. Anyways, so why don't I ask you this question? Because you mentioned it a little bit, and I'm hoping that maybe you can dig deeper into it, because that has been the topic that has been across our country, right? This idea of defunding the police. We just saw an RCMP member drag someone after a wellness check. You mentioned the death of Sabrina Abdi, and so uh, yes, can you tell us more about defunding the police and what that does, or how it's been informed by anti-racism and abolition and community organizers?
Mhm. I would say, there are entire fields of study and histories of activism connected to abolition movements around carceral structures, around policing, around neoliberal colonial juridical structures. That is a well thought through, theorized, established set of positions that include, scholars and activists and researchers and community members. There's also quite a bit of like social science, contributions that arose. You can pretty much draw a line from the late '60s, struggles of civil rights, to the mid '80s, early '80s, Reagan, Thatcher, Mulroney, that era, the eras where there was a war on drugs and a war on crime. When the shift away from those analyses started to grow, there was an appreciation that if you invest in communities, in housing, in healthcare, in education, in programming, in recreation, that people do better if they have income supports, adequate income, adequate employment and protection for employment, that people are better off. That you don't have to pay for our societal inadequacies in the emergency room or in the prison or with police. You don't have to react to those things with guns and bullets and tasers. That there are other ways to respond by investing in mental health, by investing in these other things. But you would also have to think about decriminalizing, so changing law itself. We've also seen this kind of escalation of criminalization of HIV and mental health and sex work and immigration and these kinds of things that turn into criminality. They become our ideas of criminality and inform what we think is criminal. We don't need to be this way. It's not like we don't know how to think about this differently. My argument is we have. We've thought about abolition. We've thought about other structures. I think the ask now, when people have seen the amount of death and violence, the unfairness, the way the checks and balances have failed, the internal inquiries fail, they don't bring justice. If that goes on, how long does that have to go on before we say, this thing is broken, it is not protecting, it's not protecting, it's doing more harm?
Yeah, we have three questions and we don't have enough time. So I'm going to go through them quick. We have about 10 minutes or so. We have Gregory's question. What type of systems can we as community members put in place to aid the campaign for defunding the police? So I think you touched upon it a little bit, but I think Greg wants to go in deeper and say, what are some of the systems that community members can put in place?
Mm. I need a couple months to go through, systems inside of law that then now have institutions attached to those systems of law that are also racist in design, and that those have to also be pulled apart as they overwhelmingly target Black and Indigenous people of color. So advocacy for legal, not only changes, but eradication. Some of it has to go. And thinking about what was that there for in the first place? Who does it fear? Who does it envision in terms of threat and lack and burden and cost? These ideas of undesirability forged into policy and practice and law. Mm-hmm. These things have to be advocated for changes. That's that. Then the institutions themselves and the resourcing of what else might be needed. Some of that doesn't have to start from scratch at all. 4 years. I think there's a Toronto Star article yesterday that said police have been first responders to mental health issues. What should we do differently, or should we continue? And the argument is that's not true. Mental health workers, crisis workers, assertive community treatment, supportive housing, addictions workers, they've been first responders for years, peer workers, alternative mental health models, people that provide permanent, affordable, stable housing in community organizations that serve people living with mental health issues in crisis. They do the work. They've been doing the work. They don't have the resources, though. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's this odd arrangements of siloed, non-governmental organizations that pick up pockets of the work in neighborhoods, yet we don't have a coherent, well-resourced system to respond to the needs that we know exist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to go through the quick questions. We have Sarah Mayo. What are Dr. Joseph's view on Ontario's social assistance system and its role in perpetuating racial income disparities and white supremacy?
ODSP and OW?
Yeah.
That's another one that could take a while. I think, anyone who's been on social assistance or has worked with people on social assistance knows that the amounts are not enough. They're inadequate, to say the least. Disrespectful amounts that don't acknowledge a true cost of living. They are there in ways that carry on these ideas that those who need them are undeserving of basic care, of basic support, of basic income, that they aren't members of society. What those systems do is they take people and they put them in a line of social mobility that's outside the lines of social mobility, where one can't accumulate enough to survive, much less thrive. It's a punishing regime, and when you have those regimes that are envisioned with an idea of people as burden or cheat or undesirable, they of course always are envisioned with race in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that leads us to our last question, and I think this last question, everybody has been asking this question. I mean, I think that's the big question that everyone has been asking in terms of where we are at, what's being happening, what different institutions are doing, and whatnot. So the last question is from Denise. How do you respond when someone says, "I am just one person. I can't change systems upheld"?
What do I say to them?
Yes.
I think we've been witnessing for for decades, but also very recently, how one person can be a beacon, a conduit, a voice, as like a symbol of collectivity. That there are unified voices that are gathering together and organizing in ways that we haven't seen ever. I think things are like technically different now, where we have an ability to organize across spaces with technology and share analyses in faster, more robust ways, communicate with in broader dialogue with critical voices and analyses. I think that didn't exist before. I think we're all contributors to collective struggle. And if we see ourselves as isolated, as not part of a collective struggle, then that's where the work has to be done. I think where you see yourself, your identity, how you're located historically, where you see yourself in proximity to certain moments of struggle, that should help you think about where your passions and needs and collectivity interests resides, your political interests, your social interests, your positioning in these struggles. I think position matters a lot. And when we see ourselves as just the beneficiaries or the allies without complicity, then it's difficult to locate ourselves in the struggle and connect with others. But I think a way in and way out of that is to think about how you collectivize.
Yes, collectivity, communal living, mutual love, mutual aid, those are the things that can connect us with each other and see ourselves in everybody's struggle. Um, I think your talk and everyone searching for answers has inspired folks. We have more questions coming in, but we don't have enough time. So we have about 3 minutes before I end off with my usual spiel. I just wanted to read something in solidarity with a hunger strike that's going on at Barton Jail as we speak. So I'm reading something from the Barton Prisoners Solidarity. So since COVID, the admin at the Barton jail and guards have made many changes in the jail in the name of health and safety that do little to stop the spread of COVID, but make much less work for themselves. The prisoners are expected to eat half frozen meals, accept clean sheets once a month, be denied soap, and have no visits with loved ones, all important for physical and emotional health. The guards have them on rotating lockdown with no access to fresh air, supposedly to help with physical distancing when there are still two to a cell in small and indoor spaces. The, Bat- the Barton Prisoners Solidarity would like to thank all the youth who came after hearing about the demo yesterday at the action to kick cops out of schools. They congratulate everyone and are inspired by the fight and doing it in parallel. They say we will continue to do what we can from the outside to support those inside, to break down the walls between us. We will continue to demand the release of all prisoners of the state and fight for a future without cages. So, hunger strike at the Barton jail. This is a message from the Barton Prisoners Solidarity. If you want more information about them, you can find them on Instagram, Barton Prisoners Solidarity. Um, the last thing I have to do before we sign off A big thank you to our ASL interpreters, Annette and Vanessa. They've been with us. They've been with us since we started, and they are always here. So a big thank you to them, and a big thank you to our sponsors, Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, the Canadian Heritage Department, federal government, and then Rabo Media, YWCA, Sasha, um, HIPSI, the Hamilton Immigration Partnership Council, and Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And a big thank you to Dr. Ameil Joseph for taking time out of your busy day to share with us some knowledge and your thoughts about how we defy racism in Hamilton. Racism is here. It's in every corner, city hall, our institutions. We're seeing it in schools as well. So we definitely have to defy racism, come together to change these systems, dismantle, abolish all these racist systems and institutions that are destroying and killing Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So thank you to everyone. Thank you very much. And the last word goes to Dr. Ameil Joseph, if there's anything you have to say.
Oh, I said lots. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the interpreters. Thank you, Kojo.
All right. So good night, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks. If you are thinking of what to do, there's a petition that is floating around, tinyurls.com/defund Hamilton Police. Please sign that petition. More to come. Today at council, there were over 100 people writing into council to ask for defunding the Hamilton Police Service. It's going to continue. We're going to get cops out of school. We're going to invest in our community. We're going to invest in people so that we can have community care, not violence, not racism. Thank you very much. Have a good night, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.